Welcome everyone. Today I will be explaining how to create a Discord bot in Python that announces new videos uploaded by a YouTube channel. In this tutorial, I will be using PyCard as my bot framework. I will assume that you have a basic bot up and running already. I will not be explaining how to do this in this video. Before we start, install the following packages. AIO HTTP. This is a library to make web servers that work with async syntax. This is easier to integrate with PyCard because PyCard uses this async syntax as well. This web server will be used to create the webhook to the YouTube API. XML to dict. This library converts XML to Python dictionaries. The YouTube API returns data in XML, so we use this to read it more easily. PyNGRock. This is a Python implementation of NGRock. The YouTube API has to send us information about new videos on our web server. This means our PC must be reachable from the internet. If your bot is running on a dedicated server, you can choose to port forward. But I do not want my PC open to the web. So instead I use NGRock to create a secure tunnel to my local host using their reverse proxy server. Essentially, NGRock provides us with a URL that YouTube can use for their callbacks and sends this data back to our PC so we can use it in our web server. The first thing we do is set up this NGRock tunnel. Import NGRock from PyNGRock and run the connect command. I choose to use port 8080. Next, we need to store a few values for our bot to use later. First, the YouTube channel URL for the channel that we want announcements from. Next, the callback URL that YouTube sends data to, which will be the public URL NGRock creates for us. And lastly, the channel ID of the Discord channel we want the bot to send announcements to. Now it's time to actually set up the web server. Because this is quite a bit of code, I chose to put it in a separate file. We can use PyCard's cogs to use the bot we made in a different file. First, let's import everything we need. Async IO, Python's default async library, AIO HTTP for the web and client session classes, XML to dict, Discord, and the commands from discord.ext. Let's make the cog class. I chose to call it YouTube hook. Make sure to use the commands.cog as a parent class. First, the init function. This is required to load the bot, but we will also create an empty set to store YouTube video IDs. I will later explain why we need this. Now the interesting part, the actual web server. Create a new function for launching this web server. This has to be an async function. First, we define the routes. This allows us to use the @decorators to create routes, which I think just looks a little bit nicer. Our first route is get requests to slash. The YouTube API sends us a get request right after we subscribe. We must respond to this with a hub challenge value they send to us. If we respond with this exact value, they can be sure that we are actually wanting to receive their data. So first we check if this hub challenge value actually exists. If not, then something must have gone wrong. If it does exist, then we store it in a variable by reading it from the request object and then send it back to them with a 200 code. The 200 code indicates to YouTube that everything went okay on our end. Now we have authenticated ourselves. Next up, the post route. This is where we will be receiving data about new videos. But first, we check if their post is of the proper content type. If it's not, we refuse it and we don't handle it. If it is of the proper content type, then we read all the data from the post body. We do this with the content.read function. N equals -1 here. This means that we read all available bytes. After that, we convert the XML data to a dict, so we can use it more easily. So what does this data actually look like? Well, what you can see on the screen right now is what YouTube sends you. Some information about the feed, some information about the video when it was published, and the entry object, which is basically all sorts of information about the video itself, like the URL, the title, or what channel it is from. To read this data, we have to make sure the entry part exists, to make sure nothing went wrong on their end. We also check if the video ID is not in the memory that we specified earlier. We have to do this because YouTube sends these events as well when the video is updated or deleted. Maybe they changed their YouTube title, or they changed the description, or the video was removed. I want to make sure that we don't send announcements for any of these cases, only for when a new video is published. We cannot actually recognize a video update or a description update by simply looking at the data. The data is identical to when a new video is published. Because of this, we need to store the YouTube ID of a video that we announce in our memory, so that later we can check if it's already in there, so that we don't announce it again. Next, we take all the bits of data that we want and store it in a more simple dictionary that we can use later on. Now we trigger a custom event for our Discord bot. I chose to call it New Video. We also send the data along with this event. Don't forget to send YouTube a 200 status back to let them know we received the data properly. After we define our routes, we must actually start the web server. But we cannot use their default app.run. We already have an event loop, the Discord bot, so we must attach this web server to that loop later. First, we need to define an application and attach our routes to it. Then prepare the app runner and use its setup function. Finally, we create the actual site. If you're using ngrok like in this tutorial, it must run on localhost, and make sure to use the same port as your ngrok tunnel. Now we use the wait until ready function to make sure that the bot is started, and then we finally start the site. Now that our web server is running, we are ready to receive data from YouTube, but we must also tell them that we want to receive data in the first place. This is where the subscribe function comes in. We'll use a client session to send a post request using AIO HTTP. First, we prepare the payload for our post request. We grab the channel ID from the channel URL we put in the config earlier, and then we create a payload dictionary. AIO HTTP automatically sends dicts in the form of encoded form data, so we don't need to actually specify this ourselves. The payload needs the following values. hub.callback. This is our ngrok callback URL that we defined in the config. Or it's your own server URL if you're using your own server. hub.mode. Here we say we want to subscribe. You could also unsubscribe later if you want. A hub topic. This is basically the URL that tells YouTube that we want to receive updates about a channel. Use the exact same URL as you can see on your screen, but make sure to change channel ID to the ID we created earlier. Next, hub.leastSeconds. I leave this empty for the default value, but please keep this in mind. The subscriptions run out after some time. If your bot is going to run for a long amount of time, you need to make sure that your bot resubscribes after the least time runs out. If you want to do this, I recommend that you set the least seconds manually and then create a task in your bot to run this subscribe function again after the time runs out. Then we have hub.secret. I leave it empty, this isn't needed. Hub.verify. Here we can specify the way we want to authenticate. This can be async or sync. The web server we created supports async. Finally, hub.verify. It's again something we don't need. Now that we have defined our payload, let's send it. We will send it using session.post to this URL you see below, popsuphub.adspot.com/subscribe, with our data as the payload. Who in Google decided to use that name? It's really terrible. I had to record this line a lot of times. Finally, we check if the response code is 202. If everything works as it should be 202. Add this unload function to your cog if you reload or otherwise unload cogs in your bot. If you do not do this, then the web server will remain running when you reload the cog, and your bot will crash because it will attempt to restart a second web server, which is obviously not going to work. Now, outside of the cog class, add a setup function. PyCard uses this class to add the cog. First, create the cog object with the bot as parameter. Then, add the cog object to the bot. Now we need to start the web server by attaching it to the event loop of the bot. Do this by using bot.loop.createTask and running our web server function inside of it. Now let's have PyCard actually load our cog. Back in the main file, run load extension with the name of the Python file you made the web server cog in. I call it web server. Keep in mind that this file has to be in the same directory as your main file. If it is not, then you have to specify a path. Now the final part, listening to our custom event and posting the announcement. Make a new event listener using the addBot.event decorator. The function must be called on underscore and then the name of the custom event. In our case, new underscore video. Make sure to add video data as parameter. Now let's grab the announcement channel using the ID we specified earlier in the config and build a nice looking embed message to display our announcement. Make a new discord.embed object. I gave it the video title as title and use the color I liked. We can specify the offer field, for instance the YouTube channel name or something else. YouTube stores video thumbnails in a simple URL format. By using the URL you can see here, you can get the thumbnail of any video. Simply change the video ID part in the middle. By adding the ID of the video we want to announce, we can display its thumbnail as image inside the embed. I also added a URL field with the video URL, and I added the YouTube logo as a thumbnail image. Finally, let's send the embed to the channel. Make sure to set embed equals embed. The result looks a little like this. Pretty nice, right? You can change this as you please. Maybe you want to add everyone, so that everyone gets a ping when your new video is uploaded. Alright, that's it for this tutorial. I hope this helps you create your own announcement bot. If you need it, I added a link to the GitHub page with this code in it. See you later.